Marriage had always seemed like the ultimate security, a promise of companionship, stability, and love. In the beginning, everything felt effortless. My husband was the kind of man who prioritized responsibility above all else, a quality that initially made me feel safe in his presence. He worked tirelessly to provide for us, ensuring we never lacked anything essential. His devotion was unwavering, his commitment unquestionable. Yet, somewhere in the midst of building a life together, something shifted. The long hours he spent at work stretched into late nights, leaving me alone more often than not. Conversations became routine, predictable, devoid of the warmth they once carried. When he was home, his exhaustion overshadowed everything else. His attention, once fully mine, was now divided between responsibilities that seemed endless. The man who used to look at me with admiration and desire now barely noticed when I entered a room. I convinced myself it was normal, that this was the natural progression of marriage, that love evolved from passion to partnership. Still, a quiet loneliness settled in, growing heavier with each passing day. I missed feeling wanted, being seen as more than just a wife managing the household, while my husband focused on securing our future. The absence of affection wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a chasm widening between us that neither of us acknowledged outright. I tried to ignore it, burying my dissatisfaction under the weight of practicality. Complaining felt selfish when I knew how hard he was working, how much he sacrificed for our comfort. But feelings of neglect don't simply disappear when ignored. They fester, slowly reshaping perspectives, creating a longing for something unspoken. I wasn't looking for an escape, but I couldn't shake the thought that there had to be more. Love wasn't supposed to feel this distant, this lonely. I craved excitement, the kind of attention that reminded me I was still desirable, still worthy of being pursued. The ache of being unnoticed started to overshadow the love I knew still existed between us. Doubt crept in, whispering that I was missing out on something greater. I wondered if this was how life was meant to be, or if I had settled for a version of love that no longer felt fulfilling. The space between my husband and me grew, not from anger or resentment, but from quiet neglect, an unspoken disconnect that neither of us had the courage to confront. The first time I truly noticed him was during a company gathering. My husband's boss had a presence that was impossible to ignore, self-assured, commanding, and effortlessly charismatic. He moved through the room with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how much power he held, both in business and in the way people responded to him. There was something intoxicating about the way he spoke, how his words carried weight, how people leaned in when he talked. At first I thought nothing of the casual exchanges we shared. He was polite, charming, the kind of man who knew how to make anyone feel special in conversation. Our interactions were brief, filled with nothing more than light-hearted banter and harmless compliments. Yet every time our eyes met, there was an undeniable tension, an awareness that lingered longer than it should. I told myself I was imagining things, that my loneliness was making me read too much into fleeting moments. But then the conversations became more personal. He started noticing things about me that my husband hadn't acknowledged in years. Small details, the way I styled my hair, the colour of my dress, how I spoke. His attention felt different, intentional, making me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. It started slowly. A passing compliment, a lingering glance, a knowing smirk. The way he carried himself was nothing like my husband. There was a boldness in him, an assertiveness that drew me in despite my better judgment. I found myself looking forward to these brief encounters, the stolen moments where I felt desired again. It was thrilling, dangerous even, knowing that I was enjoying something I shouldn't. One evening, after a particularly long event, I lingered a little too long in conversation with him. The way he looked at me made my heart race, made me feel like I was the only person in the room. When he leaned in, close enough that his voice was a whisper against my skin, I felt a line being crossed. I should have stepped away, should have reminded myself of the vows I had taken, but instead I stayed. And in that moment, the boundaries between right and wrong blurred into something unrecognizable. The first mistake felt like a dream I would wake up from, something surreal that couldn't possibly be real. The rush of adrenaline, the way my heart pounded as I crossed a line I had sworn I never would. It all felt like a moment suspended in time. When it was over, reality crashed down on me, heavy and unforgiving. I told myself it was just a lapse. In judgment, a single mistake that meant nothing. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. At first I avoided him, convinced that if I distanced myself, I could pretend it never happened. I threw myself into my marriage, forcing smiles, cooking favourite meals, trying to revive the intimacy that had faded. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't erase the memory of that night, the way his hands felt on me, the way he looked at me as if I were the most desirable woman in the world. The temptation to feel that again was stronger than the guilt I carried. The secrecy, the thrill of sneaking glances across the room, the stolen moments behind closed doors. It became something I craved more than I feared. I convinced myself that as long as no one found out, no one would be hurt. My husband was none the wiser, still lost in his work, still believing our life was as steady as ever. I told myself I still loved him, that what I was doing didn't change that. But the guilt didn't stay buried for long. Every moment with my husband was tainted by my deception. I'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had become this person. The woman who had once been loyal, who had built a marriage on trust, was now living a double life. I hated the deception, yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. The affair wasn't just about passion, it was an escape, a reprieve from the mundane routine of my marriage, from the loneliness I had spent years ignoring. With him, I felt alive again, like a woman who still had desires and dreams beyond household responsibilities and predictable conversations. And as much as I wanted to believe I could control the situation, I knew deep down that things had already gone too far. The moment the pregnancy test displayed those two faint lines, my entire world tilted on its axis. A wave of shock rushed over me, stealing the air from my lungs. My hands trembled as I stared at the undeniable truth, a reality I had never prepared for, a baby, a new life growing inside me. But instead of joy, an unbearable dread settled in my chest. This wasn't a blessing, it was a ticking time bomb. Questions flooded my mind faster than I could process them. Who was the father? My husband, whose touch had become rare and distant? Or his boss, the man who had awakened something in me I hadn't felt in years? The weight of my choices now bore down on me in a way I had never imagined. I had played with fire, believing I could keep it contained, but now the flames threatened to consume everything. I tried to do the math, retracing every encounter, desperately searching for an answer that would give me certainty. But the timelines blurred, overlapping in ways that made it impossible to be sure. My heart pounded as the enormity of the situation became clear. There was no easy way out of this. One way or another, the truth would catch up to me. The thought of confessing sent a chill down my spine. Telling my husband the truth would shatter him. I pictured his face, the pain in his eyes, the devastation of knowing the child he would proudly call his own might not be his. Our life, our marriage, everything would crumble. He would never forgive me, and I couldn't bear to lose him. The alternative was deception, a carefully constructed lie that could keep my marriage intact. My husband had no reason to doubt me, no reason to suspect betrayal. If I kept the truth buried, if I let him believe this child was his, I could protect the life we had built. The thought soothed me, offering a fragile sense of control over an otherwise impossible situation. But as I made that decision, a gnawing fear took root. Lies have a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly they are woven. A secret of this magnitude could never stay hidden forever. And yet, in that desperate moment, I convinced myself that silence was the only option. The alternative, losing everything, was simply too much to bear. The moment I told my husband I was pregnant, his face lit up with an emotion I hadn't seen in years, pure, unfiltered joy. He pulled me into his arms, whispering words of love and excitement, already talking about names and planning for the future. In that instant, I felt the sharp sting of guilt cut through me like a blade. He had no idea that the child he was celebrating might not be his. I smiled, nodded, played my part as the devoted wife sharing in his happiness. Every word that left my lips was a carefully crafted deception, a desperate attempt to preserve the fragile illusion of our life together. I convinced myself I was protecting him, shielding him from a truth that would break him. The lie felt necessary, even justified, but deep down I knew I was setting the stage for a disaster I wouldn't be able to contain forever. At first, things seemed to fall into place effortlessly. My husband's renewed attention made it easy to pretend, his excitement overshadowing any lingering doubts I had. He showered me with affection, making plans for our growing family, holding my hand at doctor's appointments. To him, this baby was a symbol of love, of a fresh start. But to me, it was a constant reminder of the betrayal I had buried. The unease began when my boss started piecing things together. He hadn't suspected anything at first, but the closer I got to my due date, the more I saw the shift in his demeanour. Subtle questions, passing comments that seemed harmless to others but sent waves of panic through me. I could feel his suspicion growing, see the calculation in his gaze as he tried to work out the truth. The weight of my secret became suffocating. I found myself restless, constantly checking my words, rehearsing conversations in my head, making sure I didn't slip. The stress clawed at me, stealing my sleep, leaving me irritable and paranoid. Every time my phone rang, my heart pounded, terrified that it would be him, demanding answers, exposing the truth I had fought so hard to conceal. I had thought the hardest part was making the decision to lie. But as the days passed and the walls of my deception closed in around me, I realized that living the lie was far worse. Every moment was a balancing act, every conversation a potential unraveling. And despite my efforts to keep control, I could feel it slipping through my fingers, little by little, with every passing day. The first sign of trouble came unexpectedly. My boss had never been the type to second-guess himself, always exuding confidence in every word he spoke. But during one of our brief encounters, his usual assuredness was tinged with something new, curiosity mixed with suspicion. He didn't come right out and ask, but his eyes lingered a little too long, his words carefully chosen as if he were testing the waters. At first I played it off, laughing at his offhand remark about timing and how fast life could change. But deep inside, a cold knot of fear formed in my stomach. I saw the way he studied me, assessing, calculating, piecing things together in his mind. It was only a matter of time before the questions became more direct. Days later, the shift in his demeanour became undeniable. What once had been easy, casual exchanges now felt strained. He stopped treating me like someone he had once shared intimate moments with and started looking at me like a problem that needed solving. His words became sharper, more pointed. A simple, "How are you feeling?" that didn't sound like concern. It felt like a trap, an invitation to slip up. Then came the moment I had dreaded. Alone in the break room, he cornered me with a quiet intensity that sent a chill down my spine. His voice was calm, controlled, but his eyes held an unmistakable demand for answers. "Are you sure your husband is the father?" The question hit me like a slap, and I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. I lied. Without hesitation, without a second thought, I looked him in the eye and assured him there was nothing to question. My voice was steady, my demeanour composed, but inside I was crumbling. He didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his jaw tensed, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. He wasn't convinced, and that terrified me more than anything. The conversation ended, but the damage had been done. He knew, or at the very least, he suspected, and now the one person who could unravel my entire life had a reason to start pulling at the threads. I had chosen to keep lying, but in that moment, I knew the truth was no longer mine to control. It was only a matter of time before everything collapsed around me. The unravelling began with something so small, so insignificant, that I never saw it coming. A routine checkup, a simple blood test meant to monitor my health and ensure everything was progressing normally. I had gone in without a second thought, distracted by my growing anxiety over my boss's suspicions. But what should have been another uneventful appointment quickly spiraled into the beginning of my worst nightmare. The doctor's words were calm, clinical, unaware of the panic they would soon unleash. He casually mentioned that my blood type and my husband's didn't match in a way that was genetically possible for our child. A small inconsistency, a medical curiosity to him, but to me it was a death sentence. My stomach twisted, a cold sweat forming as I nodded, pretending to absorb the information without alarm. I left the office in a daze, barely able to keep my hands steady. Every lie I had told, every careful omission was now hanging by a thread. I clung to the hope that my husband wouldn't question it, that the information would slip past him unnoticed. But fate wasn't on my side. That evening the tension was impossible to ignore. He had always trusted me, never once had he questioned my loyalty. But something about the way I avoided his gaze must have triggered a doubt, a tiny crack in the foundation of our marriage. He asked about the doctor's visit casually at first, his voice light, but I could hear the undercurrent of curiosity. I responded with vague reassurances, brushing past the details, trying to redirect the conversation. But he wasn't satisfied. Over the next few days his unease grew. He started researching, asking subtle questions, piecing together the medical impossibility the doctor had unknowingly revealed. Then came the moment I had been dreading, his request for a paternity test. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I scrambled for an excuse, a way to convince him it wasn't necessary, but the look in his eyes told me there was no way out. He wasn't accusing, not yet, but there was something worse in his gaze. Doubt. The trust he had always placed in me was beginning to erode, and I could feel the walls of my deception closing in. I had spent months crafting the perfect lie, but now, with just one test, it was all about to come crashing down. The moment the test results arrived, the last thread holding my world together snapped. My husband's silence was worse than any shouting match, worse than any curse he could have hurled at me. He simply stood there, staring at the paper in his hands, as if he could will the words to change, but the truth was unchangeable. The child he had prepared his heart for, the one he had imagined raising, wasn't his. I tried to speak, to explain, to grasp at any words that could make him understand, but there was nothing left to say. The betrayal was complete, and the devastation in his eyes was something I would never be able to forget. Without a single word, he walked away. In the days that followed, the reality of my decisions became impossible to ignore. My husband filed for divorce almost immediately. There was no hesitation, no back and forth. He refused to discuss anything beyond the logistics, what needed to be signed, what belonged to whom. Every bit of warmth and love that had once existed between us had been replaced with cold, detached finality. I had expected anger, maybe even a fight, but what hurt most was his indifference. He had given up on me completely, cut me out of his life as if I had never existed. The man who once promised to stand by me through everything now wanted nothing to do with me, and he wasn't the only one. Words spread faster than I could have imagined. Friends I had known for years stopped responding to my messages. My own family, disgusted by the scandal, distanced themselves. There were no sympathetic words, no offers of support, just judgment, whispers, and avoidance. Even the man I had risked everything for, my husband's boss, turned his back on me. When I told him about the baby, hoping he would take some responsibility, he scoffed, as if I had become nothing more than an inconvenience. "That's your problem," he said, washing his hands of me without a second thought. I had convinced myself I could control the situation, but in the end I had lost everything. My marriage, my security, my reputation, gone. And now I was left with nothing but regret, and a child who would grow up with the weight of my mistakes. Sitting alone in the quiet of an empty apartment, I was left with nothing but my own thoughts and the consequences of my choices. The echoes of my past life haunted me in ways I never could have anticipated. Once I had been a wife, someone who was loved, trusted, and respected. Now I was a woman whose decisions had led to a life filled with nothing but silence and regret. I replayed every moment that had led me here, tracing back to the very first time I allowed myself to cross that line. What had once seemed like excitement, a distraction from the monotony of marriage, had turned into a disaster that had swallowed everything I had taken for granted. The attention I had craved, the passion I had longed for, it had all been fleeting. And now the only thing that remained was the undeniable truth that my selfishness had cost me everything. Regret clung to me, weighing me down, suffocating me. I had thought I was in control, that I could manipulate the situation to suit my needs, but in the end I had been the one left behind. My husband, the man who had once loved me unconditionally, now wanted nothing to do with me. The man I had risked everything for had discarded me without a second thought, and the people I once called friends had vanished, their judgment swift and absolute. More than anything, I wished I could turn back time, undo the choices that had led to this moment. But life doesn't offer second chances for betrayals this deep. There was no going back, no fixing what had been broken. All I could do now was live with the reality I had created for myself, a reality where I was alone, carrying the weight of my mistakes with no one to blame but myself. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain and unforgiving. My child, innocent in all of this, would grow up without the stability of a family, a constant reminder of my greatest failure. I had wanted more, chased after something I thought you are a high, deserved, and in the process I had lost the one thing that truly mattered, the life I had before I threw it all away. The reality of my new life settled in like an unbearable weight, pressing down on me from every angle. The silence in my small apartment was deafening, a stark contrast to the warmth and security of the home I once shared with my husband. Every trace of that life had been erased, no family photos on the walls, no shared laughter over dinner, no comforting presence beside me, just emptiness. Raising a child alone was nothing like I had imagined. I had envisioned a joyful experience filled with love and support, but instead I faced relentless exhaustion and an overwhelming sense of loneliness. The burden of every decision, every responsibility rested entirely on my shoulders. The sleepless nights, the endless bills, the uncertainty of the future, it all loomed over me, reminding me daily of what I had lost. The financial strain was suffocating. My once comfortable life had been replaced by constant worry about how to make ends meet. There was no one to lean on, no one to share the stress. I had burned every bridge, leaving myself with no allies, no family willing to help, no friends left to call. Their silence was a reminder of how unforgivable my choices had been. The father of my child had long since disappeared, refusing to acknowledge any responsibility. He had moved on effortlessly, his life untouched by the destruction left in my wake. Meanwhile, I bore the full weight of my choices, carrying a child who would one day ask questions I dreaded answering. How would I explain my mistakes? How would I justify the lies? The thought haunted me, keeping me awake at night, filling me with regret so deep it felt inescapable. Looking back, I understood that I had no one to blame but myself. Every moment of deception, every selfish decision had led me here. I had destroyed my own life, not because of one mistake, but because of my unwillingness to stop, to tell the truth, to accept the love I already had instead of chasing something fleeting. There was no undoing what had been done. The damage was permanent, the scars irreversible. My past life was gone, and in its place was a lonely existence shaped by my betrayal. One lie had started it all, and now I would spend a lifetime paying the price.